However, to do with progress, we also have to recognise that there are still issues to do with implementation and occasionally to do with attitude. On the part of authorities, we've heard more than one reference in the past 2 days to sometimes still a residual sense of territoriality, of protection of the public authority sphere, of in principle being in favour of civil society engagement, but in practice being a little bit suspicious of what is it actually all about. And so what it tells us, what we know everywhere, it's easier sometimes to change the law than change the attitude. And so we still have a cultural change, an attitudinal change to work on together. Not to work on conflictually with authority, but to work on together. To recognise progress, yes, but still room for some improvement in implementation. Also, and I just noted, because it's the kind of thing worth exploring a bit and if necessary coming back to, a suspicion in some cases of increased tax auditing from time to time for some of those bodies regarded by public authority as more outspoken. I'd like to know a bit more about that in an evidence-led way, because if there is evidence, we should be addressing it. Precisely because it's not the role of civil society always to tell the authority what it maybe wants to hear, no more than it's the role always to tell the authority something conflictual or contested. And finally, for civil society organisations themselves, so if there are implementation issues for authority, what about for civil society? There's clearly some evidence of what I would call gaming the system. If you get a set of guidelines, you construct yourself to fit the guidelines. In other words, the guidelines are a socket through which will flow the electricity of some funds, so you develop the plug designed to fit the socket. But it may not be the plug designed to fit the needs and the public purpose which you wish to serve. And in particular, at least I picked up some threads of colleagues here, yourselves, talking about the creation of partnerships, good, but some of them paper partnerships in order technically to qualify for something that otherwise you mightn't get. The problem with paper partnerships is like paper tigers in any area. In the end, they're not real. And so in a sense, as there is progress to report, both for authorities and for civil society, there are implementation questions to be looked at. Let me come, if I could, to the third P, payments, funding, payment systems. Again, there's a great diversity of funding sources and options. Public funds from the municipal, regional, national, European and international. Philanthropic funds from donors. A growing engagement, but not universal across the region, of a more active corporate social responsibility by companies engaging in the funding of civil society. And then, of course, you're free to raise funds yourself through various means outside the conventional channels of the state or corporate funding. Some, of course, also are in service provision as civil society, and they can gain funding from the provision of services themselves, if the rules, of course, accommodate commercial income as part of the rule book, as increasingly is allowed for in most of the new frameworks. There are, however, issues about funding, and one of them is the extent to which you get what I would call donor-driven instead of needs-driven prioritisation. A donor comes with deep pockets and the big view and says you can have a slice of the cake provided you do that thing. That's better sometimes than having no funds, but it may actually be a distraction from the public purpose for which the particular civil society organisation was created. And so there needs to be a dialogue created between the donor community and the recipient community about prioritisation that respects the mutual needs, but that isn't always just singularly donor-driven, which is a risk. There is also with donor-driven funding, and particularly when it's non-national, to come with more of top-down priority setting than a bottom-up priority setting. And again, it needs mediation and dialogue between donor community and civil society. Many of you raised the question, and indeed even the Commissioner himself raised the question, of sustainability of funding over the long term, and of saying to civil society, it's easier to say than to do, but it's an important direction, that the funding, including European funding, won't be there forever. And so people need to look, if they've long-term objectives, at a diversity of funding sources for themselves. And in some cases, there is what was argued as an excessive reliance on foreign donors. Now, I don't know if the statistic is true, but I saw in one of the sets of notes from one of the working groups, which I did not attend, that in Macedonia, I think was the example cited, that 82% of the funding of civil society came from foreign sources. Now, I don't make the particular point about Macedonia, but about the mix. That's great as long as it lasts. But the as long as it lasts is the question mark. And so it does need a richer engagement at home and a wider diversity of sources. And then finally, a comment which came across from many of you, that the bigger donors, whether that's the EU, international or philanthropic, typically require you to network or to federate. They can't deal with a huge multiplicity of small-scale individual applicants frequently, so they invite civil society to even insist on degrees of coalition building and federation. And I would like to say to you, so far as we can help with this, the European Movement International, which is increasingly better organised through this region, through National Council, is willing to be one of the agents to try to assist that, the coalition building, the federating, in order to connect up to the needs of the larger donor community. Let me turn to the fourth P, process. Here there was some very rich debate to do with the advocacy and reformist role of civil society, and some very good advice that if you're getting involved as an advocate and you want to argue for reform, try to make it, please, evidence-led. Go and look for the facts. It's not about prejudice, it's not about your own personal preference, it's not about anecdote. If you're looking for systemic reform, you need a quality of research, analysis and evidence that brings to the table something of substance which makes you a credible interlocutor for public authorities. So evidence-led, important. A second point, that if you're to be credible as a civil society organisation, you need your own democratic structures. If you have what I might call a one-man band system, it's not credible. It's too individualised, it doesn't represent in any meaningful sense, and so you need a transparent rule book, an open voting system, the ability to elect people and to remove them, the ability to change people over time so you don't get stuck for it. For example, and I don't hold it out as the only practice, we in European Movement have a rule book that the likes of myself, its president, can be elected for 2 consecutive mandates of 3 years. And no matter what your personal preference is, or that of the organisation, you have to go. And I actually think that's a good rule to do with renewal and growth and development and so on. And so I make the point to you, that democratic part of organisation is part of your credibility. There's also a need for civil society and process to focus on its targets and its target groups. Not to be all over the place, but to be focused. So if you have a subject, if you have a passion, if you have a conviction, if you have your network, stay focused.